The champagne glasses clinked in perfect harmony across the elegant ballroom of the Rosewood Manor in Millbrook Heights, where 200 guests celebrated what they believed was the perfect love story. But standing at the altar in her sister's stolen wedding dress, clutching flowers that should have been hers, was a woman who knew the bride's darkest secret and was about to make sure everyone else did too. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her name was Vivienne Hartwell, and 6 months ago she had been the happiest woman alive. The successful marketing director at Premier Communications had just gotten engaged to the man of her dreams, Dr. Adrian Blackthorne, a renowned cardiologist at Mercy General Hospital. Their engagement party at the prestigious Grandview Country Club had been the talk of Millbrook Heights until her younger sister Celeste turned it into the most devastating night of her life. Vivienne had spent months planning every detail of that engagement party. The crystal chandeliers, the imported Italian roses, the champagne fountain that cost more than most people's cars. She wanted everything to be perfect for Adrian, the man who had swept her off her feet during a chance encounter at a medical conference 2 years prior. He was everything she had ever wanted. Brilliant, compassionate, devastatingly handsome, with those piercing blue eyes and that smile that could light up an entire room. But Celeste had always been the golden child. At 26, she was 2 years younger than Vivienne, yet she had always been the one who got the attention, the praise, the admiration. Where Vivienne had worked tirelessly to build her career, Celeste had effortlessly charmed her way through life as a successful fashion blogger and influencer. With her platinum blonde hair, emerald green eyes, and the kind of natural beauty that stopped traffic, Celeste had never had to fight for anything, until now. The engagement party had started beautifully. Vivienne floated through the crowd in her stunning sapphire blue dress, Adrian's arm wrapped protectively around her waist. Their friends and family mingled in the garden, the string quartet played softly in the background, and the photographer captured every magical moment. This was supposed to be their night, their celebration, their beginning. But Vivienne should have known that Celeste couldn't stand not being the center of attention. She should have seen the way her sister's eyes lingered on Adrian during family dinners, the way she found excuses to touch his arm during conversations, the way she giggled just a little too long at his jokes. She should have noticed how Celeste had started showing up at their apartment unannounced, always with some flimsy excuse about needing to borrow something or wanting to spend time with her favorite future brother-in-law. The first sign something was wrong came when Vivienne couldn't find Adrian during the toast. She had looked everywhere, the garden, the bar, the main hall, but he was nowhere to be found. Neither was Celeste. A cold dread settled in her stomach as she made her way toward the mansion's east wing, following the sound of hushed voices coming from the library. What she found there shattered her world into a million pieces. Adrian and Celeste were locked in a passionate embrace, their bodies pressed together against the mahogany bookshelf. His hands were tangled in her blonde hair, her red lips were swollen from kissing, and the way they looked at each other. It was the way Adrian used to look at her. No, it was more than that. It was raw, desperate, consuming. It was real love, and it had been happening right under her nose. How long? Vivienne's voice cut through the silence like a blade. They sprang apart, Adrian's face draining of color, Celeste's emerald eyes wide with panic. But instead of shame, instead of apology, instead of the devastation that should have followed being caught in such a betrayal, Celeste straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin with that familiar defiant look. 3 months, she said, her voice steady and unapologetic, since the charity gala at the Meridian Hotel. 3 months. While Vivienne had been planning their wedding, choosing flowers, tasting cakes, and dreaming of their future together, her fiancé had been sleeping with her sister. While she had been working late nights to afford the perfect engagement ring for their anniversary, Adrian had been sneaking around behind her back. While she had been telling everyone how lucky she was to have found her soulmate, he had been finding his in someone else's arms. "Vivienne, I can explain," Adrian started, but she held up her hand. "Don't." Her voice was eerily calm, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her chest. "Just don't." She turned to leave, but Celeste's next words stopped her cold. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but I'm not sorry it happened. We're in love, Viv. Real love. The kind you read about in books and see in movies. I know it hurts, but you can't fight destiny." Destiny. Her sister was calling the destruction of her life destiny. Vivienne walked back to the party on autopilot, her mind reeling, her heart shattered. She made excuses about Adrian feeling unwell, smiled until her cheeks hurt, and thanked guests for coming to celebrate a love that had been a lie. She held it together until the last guest left, until the caterers finished cleaning, until she was alone in her apartment with nothing but the engagement ring on her finger and the crushing weight of betrayal. But as she sat there in the darkness, something shifted inside her. The grief began to transform into something else, something harder, sharper, more dangerous. Because Vivienne Hartwell hadn't built a successful career by being passive. She hadn't clawed her way to the top of the marketing world by giving up when things got tough. And she certainly wasn't going to let her sister steal her life without consequences. 3 weeks later, Adrian showed up at her door with flowers and apologies, claiming it had been a moment of weakness, that he loved her and wanted to make things right. But Vivienne had already seen the photos on Celeste's Instagram. Romantic dinners, weekend getaways, shopping trips for what looked suspiciously like wedding dresses. She slammed the door in his face and began planning something that would make her engagement party look like a casual gathering. Because if Celeste wanted to steal her fiancé, if she wanted to destroy their sisterly bond for a man, if she wanted to play the victim while being the villain, then Vivienne would give her exactly what she deserved. And she would do it on the most important day of Celeste's life, in front of everyone who mattered, with the kind of precision and devastation that only a woman scorned could deliver. The wedding invitation arrived 2 months later, with Vivienne's name conspicuously absent from the bridal party. But that was fine. She had other plans for her role in this wedding. Plans that would ensure this day would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. Now, as she stood in that ballroom, watching her sister prepare to marry the man who had once promised to love her forever, Vivienne smiled, because sometimes the best revenge isn't getting mad, it's getting even. And she was about to serve justice on a silver platter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 6 months before that devastating wedding day, Vivienne Hartwell had been living what everyone called a charmed life. At 28, she was the youngest marketing director in the history of Premier Communications, one of Millbrook Heights' most prestigious advertising agencies. Her corner office on the 32nd floor overlooked the bustling downtown district, and her client portfolio read like a who's who of Fortune 500 companies. Vivienne had earned every bit of her success through sheer determination and brilliant strategic thinking. While other executives relied on family connections or charm, she had built her reputation on delivering results that seemed impossible. The Morrison Hotels campaign that increased their bookings by 300%. The struggling tech startup she'd transformed into a household name within 6 months. The luxury car brand that had been hemorrhaging money until Vivienne's revolutionary social media strategy turned them into the most coveted vehicle among millennials. But success in the boardroom had always come easier to Vivienne than success in her personal life. Growing up as the older sister to Celeste Monroe, their parents had given them different last names after their bitter divorce. Vivienne had learned early that she would always have to work twice as hard for half the attention. Where Celeste was naturally magnetic, effortlessly drawing people into her orbit with her infectious laugh and sparkling personality, Vivienne was methodical, calculated, precise. Their childhood had been a constant comparison. Celeste was the one who got lead roles in school plays, while Vivienne organized the behind-the-scenes logistics that made the production successful. Celeste was homecoming queen, while Vivienne was valedictorian. Celeste dated the captain of the football team, while Vivienne buried herself in college applications and scholarship essays. Even their parents had played favorites, their mother doting on Celeste's natural beauty and social grace, their father respecting Vivienne's academic achievements but never quite understanding her drive. The pattern had continued into adulthood. Celeste had built a massive following as a lifestyle influencer at Celeste, where she showcased her perfect life to 800,000 followers. Designer clothes, exotic vacations, exclusive events. Everything came easily to her. Sponsorship deals fell into her lap. Brand partnerships materialized from casual conversations, and opportunities seemed to manifest from thin air. Meanwhile, Vivienne had clawed her way up the corporate ladder through 16-hour workdays, weekend strategy sessions, and a level of professional dedication that left little room for anything else. That's why meeting Dr. Adrian Blackthorne had felt like winning the lottery. It happened at the annual Medical Innovation Conference at the Grand Meridian Hotel, where Vivienne's agency was handling the marketing campaign for a new cardiac device. She'd been standing at the back of the auditorium, taking notes on audience engagement during Adrian's keynote speech about revolutionary heart surgery techniques, when her phone had buzzed with an urgent client emergency. As she'd quietly slipped out to take the call, she'd accidentally knocked over a display of conference materials. Adrian had found her in the hallway afterward, having followed her out to help clean up the mess. Instead of the arrogant surgeon she'd expected, she discovered a man who insisted on buying her coffee to apologize for the boring conference scheduling that had caused her to leave. They'd talked for 3 hours in the hotel cafe, and Vivienne had been stunned to find someone who was as passionate about his work as she was about hers. He was brilliant, yes, but more than that, he was kind. He listened when she talked about the challenges of being a young woman in a male-dominated industry. He asked thoughtful questions about her campaigns and seemed genuinely fascinated by her strategic thinking. When she mentioned working through weekends, he'd laughed and said he'd never met someone who understood the dedication required to excel at something you loved. Their first date had been a disaster by conventional standards. Both of their phones had buzzed with work emergencies throughout dinner, but somehow that had made it perfect. They'd ended up working side by side in his apartment, she on a crisis management strategy for a client's PR nightmare, he on research for an upcoming surgery. At 2 a.m., surrounded by medical journals and marketing reports, Adrian had looked up and said, "I think I could get used to this." For 2 years, their relationship had been everything Vivienne had never dared to hope for. Adrian understood her ambition because he shared it. He supported her career goals because he had equally demanding ones. He never asked her to choose between her professional dreams and their relationship, because he knew that her success was part of what he loved about her. When he'd proposed 6 months ago in the very cafe where they'd met, with a ring he'd designed himself based on a marketing campaign she'd once created about building something beautiful from simple elements, Vivienne had finally believed she could have everything. She'd been wrong. The cruel irony was that Adrian had met Celeste at a charity gala that Vivienne had organized for the hospital's new children's wing. It was supposed to be her triumph, the event that would raise record-breaking funds while showcasing her ability to blend her marketing expertise with Adrian's medical world. She'd spent months coordinating every detail, from the silent auction items to the seating arrangements that would maximize donor interaction. Celeste had been her +1 that night because their parents were visiting and their mother had insisted that both daughters attend together as a family. Vivienne had been proud to introduce her sister to Adrian's colleagues, to show that despite their different career paths, the Hartwell-Monroe family produced successful women. She'd watched with genuine happiness as Celeste charmed the hospital board members and posed for photos with the major donors. She'd had no idea that while she was busy ensuring the event's success, coordinating with caterers and managing the live auction, her sister was laying the groundwork for the destruction of her life. Looking back, Vivienne could see the signs she'd missed. The way Celeste had started asking casual questions about Adrian's schedule. The sudden interest in medical topics that had never fascinated her before. The Instagram post from restaurants and events, where Vivienne remembered Adrian mentioning he'd been, though she'd been too busy with work to join him. But Vivienne had been so consumed with planning their engagement party, with proving to everyone, including herself, that she'd finally found her happily ever after, that she'd missed the betrayal happening right under her nose. She'd been so focused on building the perfect future that she'd failed to protect the present she already had. Now, standing in the shadow of Celeste's stolen happiness, Vivienne understood something she'd never grasped before. All those years of being the responsible sister, the hard-working daughter, the woman who earned everything through merit and dedication, none of it mattered when someone was willing to take what they wanted regardless of who they destroyed in the process. But Vivienne Hartwell hadn't built an empire by accepting defeat. She'd made a career out of turning disasters into triumphs, transforming setbacks into comebacks, and finding victory in impossible situations. And if there was one thing she'd learned from years of high-stakes marketing campaigns, it was that timing was everything. Celeste wanted to be the bride. She wanted to steal Vivienne's fiancé and parade him around like a trophy. She wanted to play the victim while being the villain. Fine. But every bride deserves a wedding gift. And Vivienne had something special planned that would make this day unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. The weeks following the discovery at her engagement party revealed a world Vivienne had never truly seen before. The intricate social ecosystem of Millbrook Heights elite, where loyalty was a luxury and alliances shifted like sand. She found herself navigating a landscape where everyone seemed to know something she didn't, where whispered conversations stopped when she entered rooms, and where the very people who had celebrated her engagement were now carefully choosing sides. The Pemberton Country Club, where Vivienne had been a member for 3 years, suddenly felt like enemy territory. She'd worked so hard to earn her place among the wives of surgeons, the daughters of old money families, the women who lunched at Le Jardin and spent their afternoons planning charity events that would later be featured in Millbrook Heights magazine. These were the circles she'd fought to enter, not through birthright like Celeste, but through sheer professional success and the social capital that came with dating one of the city's most eligible bachelors. Now she realized how precarious her position had always been. Mrs. Evelyn Sinclair, the club's social coordinator and unofficial queen bee of Millbrook Heights society, had been the first to show her true colors. Just 3 days after the engagement party, Vivienne had run into her at the club's spa, where Evelyn was holding court with a group of younger women, all of whom Vivienne recognized as Celeste's social media friends and fellow influencers. "Oh, Vivienne, darling," Evelyn had cooed with false sympathy, her voice dripping with the kind of manufactured concern that wealthy women had perfected over generations. "We heard about your little situation. Such a difficult time for everyone involved." The other women had exchanged meaningful glances, their silence speaking volumes. These were women who had never worked a day in their lives, who had married into their positions and inherited their social status. To them, Vivienne had always been an outsider, the career woman who had somehow managed to snag one of their most prized bachelors. They'd tolerated her presence because of Adrian, included her in their events because excluding a prominent surgeon's fiancé would have been socially unacceptable. But now she was just damaged goods, and they could finally show their true feelings. "I do hope you understand," continued Mrs. Pembroke, the wife of the hospital's chief administrator, "that these situations are so delicate. We must be careful about taking sides, especially when family is involved. Blood is thicker than water, as they say." The message was clear. Celeste, with her natural charm and social media influence, with her ability to make any event feel exclusive and enviable, was the sister they were choosing to support. Vivienne, despite her professional achievements and years of contributing to their charity committees, was being quietly excommunicated from the only social circle that mattered in their small, insular world. The betrayal extended beyond just the country club set. At Premier Communications, where Vivienne had built her reputation as an untouchable force in the marketing world, the atmosphere had shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. Her assistant Jennifer, who had once worshipped the ground Vivienne walked on, now avoided eye contact and delivered messages with barely concealed discomfort. The junior executives who had once competed for her attention now seemed to find excuses to work with other directors. The change became crystal clear during the monthly executive meeting when Richard Thornfield, the company's CEO, and a man who had mentored Vivienne since her early days at the firm, pulled her aside afterward. "Vivienne, I need to discuss something sensitive with you," he'd said, closing his office door with an expression that made her stomach clench. "The Morrison Hotel's account. They've requested a change in representation." Morrison Hotels had been one of Vivienne's biggest success stories, a struggling chain she'd transformed into a luxury destination brand. The account was worth millions to the agency and had been the cornerstone of her promotion to director. They cited concerns about stability in the team, Richard continued carefully. "Apparently, some personal matters have created questions about your ability to maintain focus on their brand image." Personal matters. As if discovering your fiancé's infidelity with your sister was a character flaw that affected professional competence. As if the very qualities that made her excellent at crisis management, emotional resilience, strategic thinking, the ability to remain calm under pressure, had somehow been negated by being betrayed. "I see," Vivienne had replied, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "And who exactly raised these concerns?" Richard's uncomfortable expression told her everything she needed to know. Someone had been feeding information about her personal life to her biggest client. Someone with access to details that weren't public knowledge. Someone who knew exactly how to position the narrative to make her look unstable and unreliable. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Celeste's social media network included several wives of Morrison Hotel's board members. Women who had been at the engagement party, who had witnessed the aftermath, who had probably been fed a carefully crafted version of events that painted Vivienne as the unstable career woman who had driven her man into her sister's arms. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source: her own family. Their mother, Patricia Monroe, had always been the type of woman who valued appearances above all else. She'd built her identity around being the mother of 2 successful daughters, and she'd never quite known how to handle Vivienne's ambition or Celeste's unconventional career path. But when faced with the scandal of one daughter stealing the other's fiancé, Patricia had made her choice with shocking swiftness. "Vivienne, darling, you have to understand," her mother had said during their tense phone conversation a week after the engagement party disaster. "Celeste is just following her heart. These things happen, and we can't blame love for being complicated." "Complicated?" Vivienne had repeated, incredulous. "She destroyed my engagement, Mom. She's been sleeping with my fiancé for months." "Oh, don't be so dramatic," Patricia had sighed, and Vivienne could practically hear her waving a dismissive hand. "Adrian obviously wasn't the right man for you if he could be swayed so easily. Celeste has always been more naturally suited to that kind of social position anyway. The wives of prominent doctors need a certain kind of charm, a certain way of moving through society. You're wonderful at your career, dear, but relationships require different skills." The implicit message was devastating. Even her own mother believed that Celeste was more deserving of the life Vivienne had built, more naturally suited to be the wife of a successful man, more capable of maintaining the kind of image that mattered in their social circle. Within weeks, it became clear that Millbrook Heights had made its collective decision. Celeste's engagement to Adrian was treated as a romantic fairy tale, the kind of passionate love story that justified any collateral damage. Her Instagram posts about their relationship garnered thousands of likes and comments about true love conquering all, and destiny bringing soulmates together. Meanwhile, Vivienne found herself increasingly isolated, her invitations to social events mysteriously lost in the mail, her attempts to maintain professional relationships met with polite but distant responses. She was being erased from the life she'd worked so hard to build, replaced by a sister who had never had to fight for anything and who was now being celebrated for taking everything. The country club circuit buzzed with plans for what was already being called the wedding of the decade. Celeste's influence in the social media world, combined with Adrian's status in the medical community, had created a perfect storm of excitement and anticipation. Everyone wanted to be part of their story, to be featured in the posts and photos that would document their epic love story. But as Vivienne watched her former life being redistributed like party favors, as she saw her social circle embrace her sister with the enthusiasm they'd never shown her, as she realized that professional success meant nothing in the face of social politics and family betrayal, something crystallized in her mind. If Millbrook Heights wanted a story worth talking about, if they wanted drama and spectacle and the kind of scandal that would be discussed for years to come, then she would give them exactly that. Because Vivienne Hartwell hadn't spent years mastering the art of strategic communication to be quietly erased from her own life. And if her sister wanted to play the role of the beloved bride, then Vivienne would make sure she had a wedding day that would be truly unforgettable. The attempts to salvage some semblance of dignity from the wreckage of her life began exactly 1 week after the engagement party disaster. Vivienne had spent 7 days in complete isolation, alternating between rage, despair, and a cold numbness that scared her more than the pain. But she was a problem solver by nature, and even in her darkest moments, her strategic mind was working, calculating possibilities, searching for a way to reclaim some control over the narrative that was being written about her life. Her first attempt at damage control came through professional channels. She'd scheduled a meeting with Dr. Harrison Webb, the chief of cardiology at Mercy General, and Adrian's direct supervisor. As one of her former clients, she'd handled the hospital's rebranding campaign 2 years earlier. She thought he might be willing to listen to her side of the story, to understand that Adrian's behavior raised serious questions about his judgment and character. Dr. Webb received her in his office with the kind of polite detachment reserved for uncomfortable conversations. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and the measured speaking style of someone accustomed to delivering both good and bad news with equal professionalism. "Vivienne, I appreciate you coming to see me," he'd said, gesturing for her to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "Though I must say, I'm not entirely sure what we need to discuss." She'd prepared her words carefully, focusing on the professional implications rather than the personal betrayal. "Dr. Webb, I think it's important that you understand the circumstances surrounding Adrian's change in relationship status. The pattern of deception, the manipulation of family trust, these aren't the qualities you want in someone representing your department." Dr. Webb had listened with an expression of increasing discomfort, occasionally glancing at his watch or shuffling papers on his desk. When she finished speaking, he'd leaned back in his chair with a heavy sigh. "Vivienne, I understand you're going through a difficult time," he'd said, his tone gentle but dismissive. "But Dr. Blackthorne's personal relationships aren't really within my purview unless they affect his professional performance. And frankly, he's never been more focused or productive. Whatever happened between you three is a private family matter." "A family matter?" Vivienne had repeated, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain composed. "He was engaged to me while conducting an affair with my sister. That shows a fundamental lack of integrity. That shows that sometimes relationships are complicated," Dr. Webb had interrupted, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Look, I've known Adrian for 5 years. He's one of the most ethical doctors I've ever worked with. Sometimes hearts change direction, and that's unfortunate, but it's not a professional liability. The meeting had ended with Dr. Webb's suggestion that she, quote, take some time to heal, and his assurance that the hospital wished her well in moving forward. The message was clear. Adrian's reputation was untouchable, his position secure, and her complaints were being viewed as the desperate attempts of a spurned woman to damage her ex-fiancé's career. Her next attempt came through the one avenue where she thought her expertise would carry weight: the charity circuit. The Children's Wing Fundraising Committee was meeting to plan their annual gala, and Vivienne had hoped that her track record of successful events would give her voice some authority in discussing Adrian's involvement. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, the committee chairwoman and wife of a prominent neurosurgeon, had welcomed Vivienne to the meeting with what seemed like genuine warmth. The conference room at the Meridian Hotel was filled with the usual suspects: wealthy wives, social climbers, and genuinely philanthropic individuals who had made charity work their life's mission. "Ladies, before we begin," Vivienne had said during the open discussion period, "I think we need to address the elephant in the room regarding Dr. Blackthorne's continued involvement in our events." The room had gone silent, 20 pairs of eyes turning toward her with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Mrs. Whitmore had cleared her throat delicately. "Vivienne, dear, I'm not sure this is the appropriate venue for personal grievances." "This isn't about personal grievances," Vivienne had insisted, pulling out a folder of documents she'd prepared. "It's about the integrity of our organization. We're asking donors to trust us with their money to support sick children. How does it look when one of our featured speakers has demonstrated such questionable judgment in his personal life?" Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton, a woman Vivienne had once considered a friend, had spoken up from the back of the room. "Oh, please, Vivienne, you're really going to try to destroy a man's charitable work because he fell in love with someone else? That's rather vindictive, don't you think?" "Vindictive?" Vivienne had stood up, her carefully prepared composure beginning to crack. "He was having an affair for months while planning a life with me. That's not falling in love. That's calculated deception." "That's heartbreak talking," another voice had chimed in. Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, whose daughter was friends with Celeste. "We've all seen the posts, Vivienne. Celeste and Adrian are genuinely happy together. Sometimes love just happens, and trying to sabotage their relationship makes you look, well, a bit unhinged." The word unhinged had hit her like a physical blow. These women, who had once sought her advice on event planning and marketing strategies, who had praised her professionalism and attention to detail, were now questioning her mental stability for refusing to quietly accept her sister's betrayal. Mrs. Whitmore had called for order and suggested they table the discussion for another time, but the damage was done. Vivienne had left the meeting knowing that her reputation as a rational, professional woman had been replaced by the narrative of a bitter ex-fiancé who couldn't handle rejection gracefully. The final blow came when she'd tried to reach out to Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, Adrian's colleague, and one of the few people in his professional circle whom Vivienne had considered a genuine friend. Elizabeth had been a bridesmaid in Vivienne's wedding plans, someone who had spent hours discussing everything from career challenges to relationship goals. They'd met for coffee at Café Luna, a small bistro downtown that had been one of their regular meeting spots. Elizabeth had arrived 15 minutes late, looking uncomfortable and distracted, checking her phone repeatedly throughout their conversation. "Liz, I need to ask you something honestly," Vivienne had said after they'd exhausted small talk about work and weather. "Do you really believe that Adrian's behavior has been acceptable? Do you think what he did was right?" Elizabeth had stared into her latte for a long moment before responding. "Vivienne, I think you need to understand that sometimes these things are more complicated than they appear from the outside." "What's complicated about lying and cheating?" "Look," Elizabeth had said, leaning forward with the earnestness of someone trying to be helpful, "I've seen Adrian and Celeste together. They have this connection, this energy. And honestly, I never saw that with you two. You were compatible, sure, and you made sense on paper, but what they have is different. It's like they're two halves of the same person." The words had cut deeper than any of the previous dismissals because they came from someone Vivienne had trusted, someone who had witnessed her relationship with Adrian firsthand. Elizabeth was essentially saying that Vivienne's entire relationship had been a lie, that the love she'd believed in had been a pale imitation of what real passion looked like. "So you think I should just accept that my sister destroyed my engagement because they have better energy?" Vivienne had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think you should consider that maybe this happened for a reason," Elizabeth had replied. "Maybe you weren't meant to be with Adrian. Maybe this is the universe's way of putting everyone where they belong." As Vivienne had walked back to her car after that devastating conversation, she'd realized that her attempts to seek validation, support, or even basic acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done to her were not just failing, they were actively damaging her reputation. Every person she approached with her story was choosing to reframe the narrative in a way that made her the problem. She was being painted as obsessive, vindictive, unable to accept that love was complicated and sometimes painful. Her legitimate grievances were being dismissed as the ravings of a woman who couldn't handle romantic rejection. Her attempts to expose Adrian's character flaws were being reinterpreted as desperate attempts to sabotage her sister's happiness. The cruel irony was that her professional skills, her ability to craft compelling narratives, to understand public perception, to manage crises, were useless when she was the subject of the story rather than its architect. She was learning the hard way that in the court of public opinion, the person who tells the story first often gets to control how it's remembered. And Celeste, with her natural charisma and social media savvy, had been telling her version of events from the moment their affair began. By the time Vivienne tried to present her side, the narrative was already set. Star-crossed lovers who couldn't fight their destiny, a bitter ex who couldn't let go, and a romantic story that justified any collateral damage. But as she sat in her car outside the cafe, watching Elizabeth drive away without a backward glance, Vivienne made a decision that would change everything. If no one was willing to listen to her truth, if every attempt at reason and justice was going to be dismissed and reframed, then she would stop trying to convince people with words. Sometimes the most powerful statements weren't spoken at all. The systematic dismantling of Vivienne's social standing accelerated with ruthless efficiency in the weeks that followed her failed attempts at seeking justice. What had begun as isolated incidents of dismissal evolved into a coordinated campaign of exclusion that felt almost orchestrated in its thoroughness. Every avenue she had once relied upon for professional and personal validation was methodically closed off, leaving her increasingly isolated in a city where she had once commanded respect. The most devastating blow came from an unexpected source: her own law firm's annual charity auction, an event she had organized for 3 consecutive years. The Hartwell Foundation, named after her late grandmother, who had left Vivienne a substantial inheritance, had been the primary sponsor of the Evening of Hope fundraiser, which raised money for women's shelters throughout Millbrook Heights. Vivienne had poured her heart into these events, seeing them as a way to use her marketing expertise for genuine good, while building meaningful connections with the community's philanthropic leaders. She discovered her exclusion in the most humiliating way possible, through an Instagram story posted by Miranda Castellanos, a local socialite and former client who had become something of a friend over the years. The video showed the planning committee meeting in full swing at the exclusive Rosewood Country Club, with familiar faces animatedly discussing centerpieces and auction items. Vivienne's empty chair sat conspicuously at the head of the table, the spot she had occupied as lead organizer for years. When she called Miranda directly, hoping for an explanation, the conversation was brief and brutal. "Oh, Vivienne," Miranda had said, her voice carrying that particular tone of false sympathy that wealthy women had perfected. "I thought someone had called you. We felt it would be best if you took a step back this year, given everything that's happening." Everything that's happening? Vivienne had repeated, pacing her apartment with growing agitation. You mean my sister stealing my fiancé? Well, that's one way to put it, Miranda had replied coolly. But Celeste and Adrian will be attending this year. They're actually going to announce their engagement officially at the event. And we thought it might be awkward having you there. For everyone involved. The irony was staggering. The charity event Vivienne had created, funded by her own foundation, was now being used as the stage for her sister and former fiancé to celebrate their relationship. And she was being excluded from her own event to spare everyone else's comfort. Miranda, I founded this event. The Hartwell Foundation is the primary sponsor. Actually, Miranda had interrupted, we've secured new primary sponsorship. The Blackthorne Medical Group has stepped in with a very generous contribution. Dr. Blackthorne felt it was important to support women's causes, and honestly, their involvement brings a level of medical credibility that really elevates the entire event. Vivienne had hung up the phone and immediately called her financial advisor to pull the foundation's sponsorship, only to discover that Adrian's medical group had already committed to a contribution that was triple what her foundation had provided. Her lawyer informed her that while she could withdraw her support, doing so after sponsorship materials had been printed would likely result in a lawsuit for breach of contract and would certainly generate negative publicity about her vindictive behavior. She was trapped in a cage of her own making, forced to watch as her signature charitable event became a celebration of her betrayal. The professional ostracization intensified at Premier Communications, where the office politics had shifted dramatically in ways that made Vivienne's position increasingly untenable. Her former allies began distancing themselves with the calculated precision of people protecting their own careers. James Mackenzie, the creative director who had once competed for her attention and approval, now avoided eye contact in meetings and conspicuously excluded her from brainstorming sessions. The breaking point came during the agency's monthly presentation to Hillcrest Medical Center, a lucrative account that Vivienne had personally secured 2 years earlier. She had been scheduled to present the new campaign strategy, a comprehensive rebranding effort that would position the medical center as the region's premier healthcare destination. Instead, she found herself sitting in stunned silence as Richard Thornfield announced that James would be taking the lead on the presentation. James has some fresh perspectives that we think will really resonate with the client, Richard had explained, not meeting Vivienne's eyes. Vivienne will be supporting the effort, of course, but we felt it was time to bring some new energy to the account. New energy. The phrase was corporate speak for "we don't trust you to handle our biggest medical client" while you're in the middle of a scandal involving a prominent doctor. James's presentation was competent, but unimaginative, lacking the strategic depth and innovative thinking that had made Vivienne's campaigns legendary in their industry. Yet the clients nodded approvingly, their decision clearly made before they'd even entered the room. After the meeting, Vivienne cornered Richard in his office, abandoning all pretense of professional politeness. "Richard, you know my work. You know what I've contributed to this agency. Are you really going to let office gossip destroy everything I've built here?" He had the decency to look uncomfortable as he delivered what amounted to a professional death sentence. "Vivienne, your personal situation is affecting team morale. People are choosing sides, taking positions, and it's disrupting the collaborative environment we've worked so hard to create." The Hillcrest account specifically requested James after some concerns were raised about stability in the team leadership. Concerns raised by whom, she had demanded, though she already suspected the answer. That's not really relevant. What matters is that we need to prioritize the agency's reputation and our clients' confidence. I'm recommending that you take some personal time. Maybe consider a sabbatical until things settle down. A sabbatical, career suicide, dressed up as compassionate leave. Vivienne understood the game being played. She was being maneuvered into a position where resignation would seem like her own choice rather than a forced departure. The cruelest rejection came from her own parents, whose response to the ongoing drama revealed decades of favoritism and manipulation that Vivienne had been too busy succeeding to notice. Their father, whom she had always believed respected her achievements and drive, called her on a Thursday evening with news that felt like a betrayal from beyond the grave. "Vivienne, your mother and I have been talking," he had said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone delivering difficult news. "We've decided to give Celeste your grandmother's engagement ring." The ring in question was a family heirloom, a vintage Tiffany setting with a perfect 2-carat diamond that had been promised to Vivienne since she was 16. Her grandmother had specifically mentioned in her will that the ring should go to the granddaughter who showed the most strength and independence, which everyone had assumed meant Vivienne. "Dad, that ring was promised to me," grandmother specifically said. "Your grandmother said it should go to the granddaughter who needed it most for happiness," he had corrected, his revisionist history as casual as it was devastating. "And clearly Celeste is the one building a family now. You're so focused on your career we weren't even sure you'd want a traditional symbol like that." The implication was clear. Vivienne's success had disqualified her from the traditional markers of female worth, marriage, family, the kind of happiness that was measured in wedding announcements and grandchildren rather than boardroom victories and professional achievements. Besides, her father had continued, Adrian specifically asked about family heirloom rings. He wants to propose properly, with something that has history and meaning. It's quite romantic, really. Her own family was helping her former fiancé plan his proposal to her sister using jewelry that had been promised to her. The betrayal was so complete, so thorough, that Vivienne had simply hung up the phone and sat in her apartment staring at the wall for 2 hours. The final piece of her systematic rejection came through social media, where Celeste's influence campaign had reached devastating effectiveness. The @CelesteChic account, with its 800,000 followers, had become a masterclass in narrative manipulation. Without ever directly mentioning Vivienne or the circumstances of her relationship with Adrian, Celeste had crafted a story of destined love overcoming obstacles, of two souls finding each other despite, quote, complicated family dynamics. Her posts about their relationship garnered thousands of comments praising their authentic connection and expressing relief that Adrian had, quote, found his true soulmate. The narrative had become so pervasive that even strangers on the internet had absorbed it as truth. When Vivienne's friends tried to defend her in comment sections, they were overwhelmed by Celeste's followers, insisting that, quote, real love can't be stopped, and that, quote, some people just can't handle seeing others happy. The systematic nature of her rejection was breathtaking in its completeness. Professional circles, social networks, family relationships, charitable organizations, even public opinion, every avenue that might have provided support or validation had been methodically closed off. She was being erased from her own life with surgical precision, replaced by a sister who had never had to fight for anything, and who was now being celebrated for taking everything. But as Vivienne sat in her increasingly empty apartment, surrounded by the ruins of relationships and reputation she had spent years building, she realized something that would prove to be crucial in the weeks to come. The very thoroughness of her rejection had taught her something valuable about the people she had once considered allies, friends, and family. They had shown her exactly who they were when it mattered most. And that knowledge would prove to be the most powerful weapon in her arsenal when the time came to remind them all exactly who Vivienne Hartwell really was. The transformation began in the silence of Vivienne's forced sabbatical, when the absence of corporate meetings and social obligations created a vacuum that her analytical mind couldn't help but fill. With her professional life in shambles and her personal relationships systematically destroyed, she found herself with something she hadn't possessed in years: unlimited time to think, plan, and observe. What started as aimless scrolling through social media accounts and news articles gradually evolved into something far more sophisticated, a masterclass in information gathering that would have impressed intelligence agencies. Vivienne's marketing background had taught her that successful campaigns required understanding your audience better than they understood themselves. She had always excelled at finding the hidden motivations, the secret vulnerabilities, the pressure points that could transform public opinion or consumer behavior. Now, for the first time in her career, she was applying those skills not to sell products or services, but to map the intricate web of relationships, secrets, and scandals that held Millbrook Heights elite society together. The investigation began with Adrian, whose seemingly perfect life revealed fascinating cracks under close scrutiny. Using her still active medical industry contacts and her understanding of hospital politics, Vivienne began piecing together a picture of her former fiancé that was far more complex than the golden boy image he projected. She discovered that his rapid rise through the surgical ranks at Mercy General hadn't been quite as merit-based as everyone believed. Through careful cross-referencing of hospital board meeting minutes, charity event attendee lists, and property records, she uncovered a pattern of strategic relationship building that bordered on manipulation. Adrian's mentor, Dr. Harrison Webb, had been going through a messy divorce just as Adrian's career had accelerated. The timing coincidentally aligned with Adrian's introduction to Webb's wife through the hospital's auxiliary committee, the same committee where Webb's wife had later recommended Adrian for several prestigious positions. More intriguingly, Vivienne discovered that Adrian's research funding came from a grant program overseen by Dr. Elizabeth Morrison's husband, a detail that cast their friendship in an entirely new light. The same Elizabeth who had dismissed Vivienne's concerns as jealousy had been protecting her husband's protégé all along. The revelation explained why Elizabeth had been so quick to defend Adrian's character, while simultaneously undermining Vivienne's credibility. But the most damaging discovery came through Adrian's financial records, which Vivienne accessed through a contact at their shared banking institution, a former client who still owed her a favor from a crisis management campaign that had saved his job 3 years earlier. Adrian's spending patterns revealed a man living well beyond his means, despite his substantial surgeon's salary. Expensive vacations, luxury purchases, and lifestyle choices that suggested someone trying desperately to maintain an image that didn't match his actual financial reality. The spending had accelerated dramatically since his relationship with Celeste began, as he apparently tried to keep up with her influencer lifestyle and social media image. What the public saw as a successful surgeon spoiling his beloved was actually a man drowning in debt to finance a relationship that was rapidly becoming financially unsustainable. Celeste's digital empire, which appeared so effortlessly successful to her followers, revealed even more interesting vulnerabilities under professional scrutiny. Vivienne's marketing expertise allowed her to analyze engagement patterns, follower demographics, and sponsorship deals with the precision of a forensic accountant. What she discovered was a carefully constructed house of cards that was far more fragile than anyone realized. The @Celeste brand was hemorrhaging money. Despite her impressive follower count, Celeste's actual engagement rates had been declining steadily for months. Her audience was aging out of the demographic that brands wanted to reach, and younger influencers with more authentic content were rapidly gaining market share. More damaging still, several of her recent sponsorship deals had been terminated due to failure to meet performance metrics. Information that was buried in the fine print of industry publications, but devastating to someone who understood how to read between the lines. Vivienne's investigation revealed that Celeste had been using increasingly desperate tactics to maintain her lifestyle and social media presence. Fake engagement through bot networks, undisclosed paid partnerships that violated FTC guidelines, and sponsored content that walked the line of false advertising. Most damaging of all, Celeste had been accepting payment for promoting products she didn't actually use, including a luxury skincare line that she was secretly allergic to, a fact Vivienne discovered through pharmacy records that showed regular prescriptions for allergy medications coinciding with the product endorsement campaign. The deeper she dug, the more Vivienne realized that both Adrian and Celeste were essentially frauds, maintaining expensive illusions that were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Their relationship, which appeared so perfect on social media, was actually built on mutual desperation: his need for her social connections and influence, her need for his medical credentials and perceived stability. But the most explosive discovery came through Vivienne's investigation into the timeline of their relationship. Using digital forensics techniques she had learned from cybersecurity campaigns, she traced the metadata from Celeste's photos and social media posts to establish exact dates and locations. What she found contradicted the romantic love-at-first-sight narrative they had been selling to the public. Adrian and Celeste's relationship had begun not at the charity gala where they claimed to have met, but months earlier at a medical conference in Chicago where Celeste had been hired as a social media consultant by the pharmaceutical company sponsoring the event. The initial contact had been purely transactional, Adrian paying Celeste for social media services to boost his professional profile among younger demographics. The evidence trail showed that their romantic relationship had evolved gradually from this professional arrangement, with Celeste systematically gathering information about Adrian's personal life, including details about his relationship with Vivienne. Screenshots of deleted posts, cached web pages, and digital communications painted a picture of careful planning rather than spontaneous passion. Most damning of all, Vivienne discovered that Celeste had been documenting her strategy in private social media accounts used for industry networking. Messages to other influencers discussed landing a doctor as a career move and planning posts that would create the perfect love story content for her brand. There were even discussions about the family drama angle being good for engagement and follower growth. The revelation that her sister had treated the destruction of Vivienne's life as content strategy, as a marketing opportunity to boost her personal brand, was so coldly calculated that it took Vivienne's breath away. Celeste hadn't stolen Adrian in a moment of passion or even genuine love. She had systematically targeted him as a strategic career move, planned the affair like a business acquisition, and documented the process for social media engagement. Armed with this information, Vivienne began to understand the true scope of the deception that had destroyed her life. She wasn't the victim of a tragic love triangle or star-crossed lovers following their hearts. She was the casualty of a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to advance two desperate people's careers and social standing at her expense. But knowledge without strategy was powerless, and Vivienne's marketing background had taught her that timing and presentation were everything. She couldn't simply dump this information online or confront them directly. That would make her look vindictive and desperate, exactly the narrative they had already established about her character. Instead, she began developing something far more sophisticated, a comprehensive communication strategy that would systematically dismantle the mythology they had built around their relationship, using their own tools and platforms against them. She would give them enough rope to hang themselves, create the conditions for their lies to collapse under their own weight, and ensure that when the truth finally emerged, it would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. The wedding they were planning with such fanfare would be the perfect stage for this revelation. All of Millbrook Heights' elite would be gathered in one place, social media would be primed for maximum engagement, and the contrast between their public image and private reality would be impossible to ignore. For the first time since that devastating night at her engagement party, Vivienne smiled, because she had discovered something that Adrian and Celeste had forgotten in their rush to celebrate their victory. The person who controls information controls the narrative. And Vivienne Hartwell was about to remind them all exactly how powerful the truth could be when wielded by someone who truly understood how to use it. The methodical construction of Vivienne's revenge strategy transformed her empty apartment into a war room that would have impressed military tacticians. Her dining table disappeared under layers of printed documents, timeline charts, and relationship maps that traced the interconnected web of Millbrook Heights' social and professional hierarchies. Her laptop screens displayed multiple spreadsheets tracking everything from vendor contracts to guest lists, while her walls became covered with photographs and newspaper clippings arranged in patterns that revealed the hidden connections between seemingly unrelated events. But this wasn't the desperate conspiracy board of someone losing their grip on reality. This was the systematic campaign planning of a master strategist applying 15 years of marketing expertise to the most important project of her career, ensuring that justice would be served with surgical precision on the day when it would cause maximum impact. Vivienne's first masterpiece was the creation of multiple digital identities that would allow her to monitor and influence the wedding preparations without detection. Using her knowledge of social media algorithms and engagement patterns, she developed 3 separate Instagram accounts that appeared to be run by different people, but were all under her control. At Millbrook Moments posed as a local lifestyle blogger, documenting high society events. At Wedding Whispers functioned as an anonymous gossip account that shared insider information about upcoming nuptials. At Truth Teller MH operated as a community watchdog focused on exposing fraud and deception among local influencers. Each account had its own distinct voice, posting history and follower base that Vivienne had carefully cultivated over months. She used her understanding of demographic targeting to ensure that each account reached different segments of Millbrook Heights society, from young professionals who followed wedding trends to older social media users who preferred more traditional content formats. The accounts cross-referenced and supported each other's content, creating an echo chamber that amplified certain narratives while appearing to be independent sources. Through these digital personas, Vivienne began seeding doubt about various aspects of Adrian and Celeste's relationship without ever making direct accusations. At Millbrook Moments posted innocent observations about the speed of their engagement, wondering aloud whether such quick relationships could really be built on solid foundations. At Wedding Whispers shared anonymous tips about the financial strain that elaborate weddings could place on young couples, particularly when one partner had expensive tastes and the other was just starting their career. At Truth Teller MH focused on the broader issue of influencer authenticity, highlighting general patterns of deceptive marketing practices without naming specific individuals. The genius of this approach was that none of the content violated social media platforms' harassment policies or could be traced back to personal vendettas. Vivienne was simply raising questions that any thoughtful observer might ask, using the same engagement-driving techniques that had made her so successful in her marketing career. The posts generated genuine discussion and debate among real users, creating organic momentum that couldn't be dismissed as coordinated harassment. Simultaneously, Vivienne was executing a far more sophisticated operation behind the scenes, systematically documenting every vendor contract, service agreement, and financial arrangement related to the wedding. Her investigation had revealed that Adrian and Celeste were funding their elaborate ceremony through a combination of credit arrangements, delayed payment plans, and promises of social media exposure that they might not be able to deliver. Using her industry connections and reputation for discretion, Vivienne began conducting, quote, background research on various wedding vendors, ostensibly for clients who needed reliable service providers. These conversations allowed her to gather intelligence about the payment schedules, contractual obligations, and potential vulnerabilities in the wedding's logistical framework. She discovered that the photographer was owed money from previous events, the florist required full payment 48 hours before delivery, and the catering company had a strict policy about canceling services if payments were late. More importantly, she learned that several vendors were already expressing concerns about the couple's ability to pay. The luxury car rental company had required additional collateral after running credit checks. The destination bachelor party in the Hamptons had been scaled back due to scheduling conflicts that were actually budget constraints. Even the venue had required a substantially larger deposit than usual after reviewing the couple's financial information. But Vivienne's most brilliant stroke was her infiltration of the wedding planning process itself. Through a former colleague who had left Premier Communications to start her own event management company, Vivienne learned that Celeste's wedding planner was overwhelmed and understaffed. Posing as a freelance marketing consultant specializing in luxury events, Vivienne offered her services pro bono as a, quote, portfolio building opportunity. The wedding planner, stressed and behind schedule, gratefully accepted the help. Suddenly, Vivienne had legitimate access to vendor communications, timeline documents, and logistical details that would have been impossible to obtain through external surveillance. She could monitor every aspect of the wedding preparation while appearing to be a helpful professional contributor to its success. This position allowed her to implement subtle sabotage that would create maximum chaos at precisely the right moment. She identified critical dependencies in the wedding timeline, moments where delays or complications would cascade through the entire event. The flower delivery that had to coordinate with the setup crew. The photographer's schedule that depended on specific lighting conditions. The catering timeline that required precise coordination with the ceremony's conclusion. Vivienne began building fail-safes into the planning process, creating situations where seemingly minor problems would trigger major disruptions. She scheduled vendor deliveries with minimal buffer time, arranged overlapping service requirements that would strain resources, and identified single points of failure that could derail entire aspects of the celebration. To anyone reviewing the plans, everything appeared professionally organized and thoroughly considered. Only Vivienne understood how fragile the entire structure really was. Her masterpiece was the construction of a comprehensive media strategy that would ensure maximum coverage of whatever revelations emerged during the wedding. She had spent weeks cultivating relationships with local journalists, social media influencers, and gossip bloggers, providing them with exclusive content about other events that established her as a reliable source of insider information. When the time came, she would have a network of content creators primed to cover the story from multiple angles. But the most sophisticated element of her plan was the psychological warfare she was conducting against the couple themselves. Through her various digital personas and carefully placed real-world interactions, she was creating an atmosphere of subtle pressure and mounting stress that was affecting their relationship dynamics. The anonymous comments questioning their compatibility, the financial pressures from wedding expenses, the social media scrutiny that made every interaction feel performative, all of it was slowly eroding the foundation of their partnership. Adrian had begun showing signs of anxiety that were affecting his professional performance. Colleagues at the hospital had noticed his increased irritability and decreased focus. His financial stress was creating tension that spilled over into his interactions with Celeste, who was struggling to maintain her social media presence while dealing with the reality of a relationship that was more work than passion. Celeste's engagement content was becoming increasingly forced and artificial as she tried to maintain the perfect love story narrative while dealing with a fiancé who was growing more distant and demanding by the day. Her follower engagement was continuing to decline, and the brands that had initially been excited about her wedding content were becoming less responsive as they noticed the decreased interaction rates. The couple was slowly destroying themselves under pressures they didn't fully understand, weakening their ability to present a united front when the final revelation came. They were becoming isolated from each other at the exact moment when they would need mutual support the most. As the wedding date approached, Vivienne reviewed her preparations with the satisfaction of a general surveying perfectly positioned troops before a decisive battle. Every piece was in place, every contingency planned, every vulnerability mapped and ready to exploit. She had transformed from victim to strategist, from betrayed sister to master manipulator, from damaged goods to the architect of perfect justice. The wedding of the century was about to become the scandal of the decade, and Vivienne Hartwell was going to ensure that everyone remembered exactly how it felt to underestimate her. The first crack in Adrian and Celeste's perfect facade appeared on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks before their scheduled wedding date, when Dr. Harrison Webb summoned Adrian to his office for what he called an urgent discussion regarding your professional standing. The conversation that followed would set in motion a cascade of crises that would transform their dream wedding into a nightmare of epic proportions. "Adrian, I'm going to be direct with you," Dr. Webb had said, his expression more serious than Adrian had ever seen it. "There are questions being raised about your research funding allocation, specifically regarding the Patterson Heart Study grants you've been administering. The blood had drained from Adrian's face as the implications sank in. The Patterson grants were worth $2.3 million annually and represented the foundation of his research career. More importantly, they were the primary reason he had been fast-tracked for promotion to senior attending physician. If there were irregularities in how those funds had been managed, his entire career could collapse overnight. What kind of questions? Adrian had asked, though his voice betrayed the panic he was trying to suppress. Dr. Webb had slid a folder across his desk containing bank records, expense reports, and travel receipts that painted a damning picture. The Grant Oversight Committee has been conducting routine audits, and they've identified what appear to be personal expenses charged to research accounts. Conference registration fees for events that don't exist. Travel expenses for trips that weren't related to approved research activities. Equipment purchases that can't be located or accounted for. What Adrian didn't know was that Vivienne had spent weeks meticulously analyzing his financial records and professional documentation, looking for any irregularities that could be reported to oversight committees. She had discovered that Adrian's expensive lifestyle hadn't been funded entirely through credit. He had been supplementing his income by creatively interpreting grant fund usage guidelines, charging personal expenses to research accounts when he thought no one was paying attention. The beauty of Vivienne's strategy was that she hadn't fabricated anything. She had simply compiled existing evidence and presented it to the appropriate authorities through anonymous tips that couldn't be traced back to her. The investigation was entirely legitimate, conducted by people who had no idea they were being used as instruments of her revenge. The committee wants a full accounting of every expense charged to grant funds over the past 18 months, Dr. Webb continued. And Adrian, if they find evidence of misappropriation, it won't just be your position here that's at risk. Grant fraud is a federal offense. Adrian left that meeting knowing that his career hung by a thread, and the financial documentation that could save or destroy him was buried in boxes of receipts that he had never bothered to organize properly. The man who had always relied on charm and connections to smooth over problems was facing a crisis that required meticulous attention to detail and perfect documentation, skills he had never developed. Meanwhile, Celeste was dealing with her own catastrophe that threatened to unravel everything she had built over years of careful brand management. Her largest remaining sponsor, Luxe Beauty Collective, had terminated their contract without warning after what they called irregularities in engagement metrics and audience demographics. The email had arrived while she was filming content for her wedding preparation series, forcing her to maintain her cheerful facade while reading words that spelled professional disaster. Recent audits of your account performance have revealed concerning patterns that suggest artificial inflation of engagement numbers. This violates Section 4.2 of our Influencer Partnership Agreement and constitutes grounds for immediate contract termination. What Celeste didn't realize was that Vivienne had been systematically reporting her various social media violations to brands and platforms for weeks. Armed with technical knowledge about how engagement algorithms worked and what constituted fraudulent activity, Vivienne had built airtight cases against her sister's business practices, using screenshots, data analysis, and documentation that was impossible to dispute. The loss of Luxe Beauty represented more than just lost income. It was a signal to other brands that Celeste's influence was declining and her business practices were questionable. Within days, 3 other sponsors had quietly ended their partnerships, leaving Celeste scrambling to maintain her lifestyle while facing the reality that her income stream was evaporating, just as wedding expenses reached their peak. But the crisis that threatened to destroy everything came from an unexpected direction. Their venue, the exclusive Rosewood Manor, which had seemed like the perfect setting for their fairy tale wedding. The Manor's event coordinator, Mrs. Diana Westfield, called Celeste on a Friday afternoon with news that sent her into a panic. "Miss Monroe, I'm calling regarding your final payment, which was due yesterday according to our contract." Our accounting department shows that your deposit has been paid, but the remaining balance of $47,000 is still outstanding." Celeste's heart had stopped. The final venue payment was supposed to come from Adrian's research fund allocation, money he had assured her would be available from a consulting bonus he was expecting. But with his grant funding under investigation, those funds were frozen pending the audit results. "There must be some mistake," Celeste had said, her voice rising with desperation. "Dr. Blackthorne assured me the payment would be processed this week." "I understand these situations can be complicated," Mrs. Westfield had replied with the professional sympathy of someone who had seen wedding dreams crumble before. "However, our contract is quite clear. If the final payment isn't received by Monday morning, we'll have no choice but to release your date to our waiting list. I should mention that we have 3 other couples interested in that particular weekend." The threat was clear: pay immediately or lose the venue 3 weeks before the wedding date. Finding another location on such short notice would be impossible, especially one that could accommodate their guest list and meet the standards expected by Millbrook Heights society. Without Rosewood Manor, their wedding would go from exclusive event to embarrassing scramble. Desperate, Celeste had tried to reach Adrian, but he was unreachable, buried in meetings with lawyers and accountants as he tried to organize the documentation that might save his career. When they finally connected that evening, their conversation revealed the full scope of their crisis. "The grant money is frozen," Adrian had explained, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "I can't access any of those funds until the investigation is complete, and my lawyer says that could take months." "Months?" Celeste had shrieked. "Adrian, the wedding is in 3 weeks. The venue payment is due Monday, the caterer needs final numbers, the photographer wants his deposit." "I know." Adrian had snapped, the stress finally breaking through his usual composed demeanor. "Do you think I don't know what's at stake here? My entire career could be over. We might need to postpone the wedding until—" "Postpone?" The word came out as a strangled whisper. Celeste's entire brand was built around this wedding. She had been documenting every aspect of the preparation for months, promising her followers the wedding content of a lifetime. Her remaining sponsors were counting on the coverage. Her social media strategy for the next year depended on wedding-related content, and her reputation as an influencer would never recover from the humiliation of postponing her own wedding due to financial problems. But beyond the professional implications, there was something else that terrified Celeste even more: the growing realization that their relationship might not survive the pressure they were under. The fairy tale romance she had crafted for social media was revealing itself to be far more fragile than she had admitted, even to herself. Adrian was becoming increasingly distant and resentful, blaming her expensive tastes for their financial predicament while refusing to acknowledge his own role in their crisis. Celeste was discovering that the man she had thought she loved was someone who crumbled under pressure, who lashed out when cornered, who expected her to solve problems while taking no responsibility for creating them. As Friday evening turned into a sleepless night of desperate phone calls to banks, family members, and anyone who might be able to provide emergency funding, both Adrian and Celeste began to understand that they were facing something far more dangerous than financial problems or professional setbacks. They were facing the complete collapse of everything they had built together, and they were facing it alone, without the support systems they had systematically destroyed in their rush to build their perfect life. The very people who might have helped them were the same people they had alienated, dismissed, or betrayed on their way to the top. And somewhere in Millbrook Heights, Vivienne Hartwell was watching the foundations of their empire crumble exactly as she had planned, knowing that the crisis they were experiencing was only the beginning of what was coming their way. The week before, the wedding transformed into a frantic scramble for salvation that revealed just how helpless Adrian and Celeste were when their carefully constructed support systems failed them. Desperate to solve their mounting crises, they turned to every expert, authority figure, and influential contact they could reach, only to discover that the very people who had once celebrated their success were now mysteriously unavailable, uninterested, or unable to help. Adrian's first attempt at damage control involved hiring Margaret Blackstone, Millbrook Heights' most prestigious crisis management attorney, whose client list read like a who's who of the medical community's most powerful figures. Her reputation for making scandals disappear and protecting professional careers was legendary, and Adrian had been certain that her intervention could resolve the Grant investigation before it destroyed everything he had worked for. The meeting took place in her downtown office, where Adrian laid out his situation with the confidence of someone who had always been able to buy his way out of problems. He explained the Grant irregularities as honest mistakes, paperwork errors that could be corrected with proper documentation and professional guidance. Margaret had listened with the practiced patience of someone who had heard similar stories countless times before. When he finished his presentation, she had leaned back in her leather chair and delivered a verdict that shattered his remaining confidence. "Dr. Blackthorne, I'm going to be frank with you," she had said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who never wasted words. "The evidence against you is substantial and well documented. Someone has done an exceptional job of compiling a case that would be difficult to defend even under the best circumstances. But more problematically, the investigation has been conducted with such thoroughness that attempting to challenge it would only draw more attention to activities that you frankly cannot afford to have scrutinized." She had slid a folder across her desk containing copies of documentation that Adrian didn't even know existed: bank records, expense reports, travel receipts, and correspondence that painted a picture of systematic misuse of research funds spanning back 2 years. "My advice," Margaret had continued, "is to cooperate fully with the investigation, accept whatever penalties are recommended, and hope that your cooperation might allow you to salvage some portion of your career. Attempting to fight this would be professional suicide." The retainer she quoted for even minimal representation was $50,000 up front, money that Adrian simply didn't have with his accounts frozen and his financial situation already precarious. Margaret's polite but firm decline to work on contingency or payment plans made it clear that she didn't consider his case worth the risk to her own reputation. Celeste's attempts to save her influencer empire proved equally futile when she reached out to Alexandra Chen, the premier social media crisis consultant, whose agency specialized in rehabilitating damaged online reputations. Alexandra's client list included celebrities who had survived major scandals and influencers who had rebuilt their brands after devastating controversies. The consultation took place via video call, with Celeste explaining her situation as a series of misunderstandings and technical errors that had been blown out of proportion by competitors and jealous rivals. She presented herself as the victim of a coordinated attack designed to destroy her success and steal her brand partnerships. Alexandra had listened with the skeptical expression of someone who had heard every possible excuse for social media misconduct. When Celeste finished her presentation, Alexandra's response was as devastating as it was professional. "Celeste, I've reviewed your account analytics, and I need to be honest about what I'm seeing," Alexandra had said, pulling up charts and graphs that showed engagement patterns, follower demographics, and interaction rates. "The evidence of artificial engagement manipulation is overwhelming and impossible to dispute. Bot networks, purchased followers, fake reviews. These aren't technical errors or misunderstandings. These are deliberate violations of platform policies and advertiser guidelines." She had continued with the kind of brutal honesty that destroyed illusions. "More importantly, your authentic engagement rates have been declining for months, which suggests that your content strategy isn't resonating with real audiences. Even if we could resolve the fraud allegations, rebuilding your brand would require starting from scratch with a completely new approach." The cost estimate for attempting to salvage Celeste's reputation was staggering: $75,000 for a 6-month rehabilitation campaign with no guarantee of success. Alexandra made it clear that she only took on clients with realistic chances of recovery, and Celeste's situation had too many red flags to justify the investment of time and reputation that would be required. Their desperate search for financial solutions proved even more humiliating when they approached Richard Pemberton, president of Millbrook Heights First National Bank, and someone who had once considered Adrian a promising young professional worthy of preferential treatment. Richard had been a guest at their engagement party and had expressed enthusiasm about their future together. The meeting in his office revealed how quickly professional relationships could evaporate when money was involved. Richard had reviewed their financial statements and loan applications with the cold efficiency of someone who had no personal connection to their situation. "I'm afraid the bank's position is quite clear," he had said, his tone professionally distant. "Dr. Blackthorne's current legal situation makes him an unacceptable credit risk, and Miss Monroe's income verification shows a significant decline in earnings over the past quarter. We simply cannot justify extending the kind of credit you're requesting given these circumstances." Adrian had tried to leverage his position at the hospital, mentioning his research contributions and future earning potential, but Richard's response had been swift and final. "Dr. Blackthorne, your employment status is currently under review by your own institution. Until that investigation is resolved and your professional standing is clarified, any loan application would be automatically denied by our underwriting department." Even their families, who had once been so supportive of their relationship, proved unable or unwilling to provide the financial assistance they desperately needed. Adrian's parents, both retired and living on fixed incomes, simply didn't have access to the kind of money required to solve their crisis. When Adrian had suggested they consider a second mortgage on their home, his father's response had been both disappointing and revelatory. "Son, we're proud of what you've accomplished, but we're not going to risk our retirement security to fund a wedding that you clearly can't afford," he had said with the blunt honesty of someone who had worked too hard for his money to see it wasted on appearances. Celeste's mother, Patricia, had been even less helpful when approached for emergency funding. Despite her previous enthusiasm for the wedding and her obvious favoritism toward her younger daughter, Patricia's response revealed the limits of her support. "Darling, I simply don't understand how you've gotten yourselves into this situation," she had said during their tense phone conversation. "I gave you the ring, I've been planning the rehearsal dinner, but I'm not in a position to cover your venue costs. Perhaps you should consider a smaller, more modest celebration until your finances improve." A smaller, more modest celebration. The suggestion was devastating to Celeste, whose entire brand was built around luxury and exclusivity. Scaling back their wedding would be admitting failure publicly, destroying the narrative of success and affluence that had defined her social media presence. But the most crushing blow came when they realized that their social circle, the same people who had been so eager to celebrate their engagement and participate in their wedding festivities, were systematically distancing themselves from the couple as word of their troubles spread through Millbrook Heights' tight-knit community. Mrs. Evelyn Sinclair, who had once competed to be included in their wedding planning, suddenly became unavailable for calls and meetings. The couples who had been excited about the bachelor and bachelorette parties began making excuses about scheduling conflicts. Even their wedding party members started expressing concerns about their ability to fulfill their financial obligations for associated events. As the weekend before their wedding arrived, Adrian and Celeste found themselves completely isolated, facing insurmountable problems with no viable solutions and no support system to help them navigate the crisis. Every expert they had consulted had essentially told them that their situation was hopeless. Every authority figure they had approached had declined to help. Every friend and family member they had turned to had proven unable or unwilling to provide the assistance they needed. They were discovering the harsh reality that success built on deception and manipulation was fundamentally unstable, and that the very qualities that had helped them climb to social prominence, their willingness to betray trust, their focus on appearances over substance, their treatment of relationships as transactional opportunities, had left them friendless when they needed support most. The wedding that was supposed to be their ultimate triumph was rapidly becoming their public humiliation, and they were completely powerless to stop the cascade of failures that threatened to destroy everything they had built together. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, with golden sunlight streaming through the windows of Rosewood Manor, as vendors arrived to transform the elegant venue into what guests expected would be the social event of the season. Despite their mounting crises, Adrian and Celeste had managed to scrape together enough emergency funding, through credit advances, borrowed money, and delayed payments, to ensure that their wedding would proceed as scheduled. They had convinced themselves that if they could just get through this day successfully, they would find a way to solve their problems afterward. What they didn't know was that Vivienne Hartwell had spent the previous night making final preparations for the most important presentation of her career. She arrived at Rosewood Manor at 7 a.m., 3 hours before guests were scheduled to arrive, dressed in an elegant navy blue dress that suggested professional authority rather than celebration. In her hands was a leather portfolio containing documents that would change the trajectory of the day, and possibly several lives, in ways that no one could have anticipated. The first person she encountered was Mrs. Diana Westfield, the venue coordinator who had been struggling all week to manage the increasingly chaotic demands of a wedding that seemed perpetually on the verge of collapse. Diana had been fielding panicked calls from vendors worried about payment, managing last-minute changes to accommodate budget constraints, and trying to maintain professional composure while dealing with a bride and groom who were clearly in over their heads. "Mrs. Westfield," Vivienne said, approaching with the confident stride of someone who belonged exactly where she was. "I'm Vivienne Hartwell. I believe we need to have a conversation before this event proceeds any further." Diana looked up from her clipboard with the weary expression of someone who had been expecting another crisis. She had been vaguely aware that there was some family drama surrounding this wedding, something about the groom's previous relationship, but she had learned long ago not to involve herself in clients' personal issues. "I'm sorry, Miss Hartwell, but if you're not on the approved vendor list or the guest registry, I really can't." "I'm the bride's sister," Vivienne interrupted calmly. "And I have information about this wedding that you and your guests deserve to know before you become unwitting participants in a massive deception." Diana's expression shifted from professional politeness to genuine concern. In her 15 years of managing high society events, she had seen her share of family drama, financial disasters, and last-minute revelations that turned celebrations into catastrophes. But something about Vivienne's composed demeanor and professional presentation suggested this was different, more serious, and potentially more damaging than the usual wedding day theatrics. "What kind of information?" Diana asked, setting down her clipboard and giving Vivienne her full attention. Vivienne opened her portfolio and began laying out documents with the methodical precision of someone delivering a boardroom presentation. "Mrs. Westfield, are you aware that the groom is currently under federal investigation for research fund misappropriation? Or that the bride has been terminated by multiple sponsors for fraudulent social media practices? Or that they've been planning this wedding with money they don't have while lying to vendors about their ability to pay?" Diana's eyes widened as she scanned the bank statements, termination letters, and investigation documents that Vivienne had carefully organized. Each piece of evidence was documented, verified, and presented with the kind of professional thoroughness that made denial impossible. "More importantly," Vivienne continued, "are you aware that this entire relationship was built on a calculated plan to destroy my engagement and steal my fiancé for social media content? Because I have evidence of that too." She pulled out printed screenshots of deleted social media posts, cached web pages showing the evolution of their relationship timeline, and digital communications that revealed the strategic nature of what the public had been told was a spontaneous love story. Diana studied the documents in stunned silence, her professional composure giving way to genuine shock as the implications became clear. "Miss Hartwell, if this information is accurate, there are serious legal and ethical implications for our venue. We cannot knowingly facilitate an event that involves fraud or deception. I understand your position, Vivienne replied. And I want to be clear that I'm not asking you to cancel the wedding or create a scene. I'm simply asking you to ensure that the people attending this event have access to the truth before they participate in celebrating what they believe is a legitimate relationship. At that moment, the first wedding party members began arriving for photographs and final preparations. Celeste's bridesmaids, a carefully curated group of fellow influencers and society wives, bustled into the bridal suite with the excited energy of people who expected to be part of a fairy tale celebration. Adrian's groomsmen, colleagues from the hospital, and members of Millbrook Heights' professional elite gathered in the groom's preparation area, checking their phones and discussing golf handicaps. None of them were aware that their entire understanding of the event they were participating in was about to be fundamentally challenged. Vivienne had timed her intervention perfectly. She understood from her marketing background that the most effective communications campaigns reached audiences when they were most receptive to new information. Wedding guests arriving early before the ceremony began would be in a social mindset, curious, observant, and likely to share interesting information with others. Her first target was Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, who arrived early as part of the wedding party and was immediately approached by Vivienne in the Manor's elegant foyer. Elizabeth's expression shifted from surprise to obvious discomfort when she saw her former friend. "Vivienne," Elizabeth said, her voice carefully neutral. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I wouldn't miss my sister's wedding," Vivienne replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Elizabeth, before the ceremony begins, I think there's something you should know about the research funding investigation that's threatening Adrian's career." She handed Elizabeth a manila envelope containing copies of the grant misappropriation evidence, financial records showing Adrian's debt situation, and documentation of his attempts to hide personal expenses within research accounts. "The Patterson Grant Oversight Committee has been very thorough in their investigation," Vivienne explained as Elizabeth scanned the documents with growing alarm. "I thought you should know, since your husband's department will likely be affected when the findings are made public next week." Elizabeth's face went pale as she realized the implications for her own family's professional standing. Her husband's research department had been collaborating with Adrian on several projects, and any association with grant fraud could damage his reputation and funding prospects. "Vivienne, where did you get this information?" Elizabeth asked, though her voice suggested she already suspected the answer. "From the same sources available to any concerned citizen who knows how to file proper information requests," Vivienne replied smoothly. "Public records, oversight committee reports, financial disclosures. Amazing what you can learn when you know where to look." She moved through the arriving guests with surgical precision, delivering carefully targeted information to specific individuals who would be most affected by the revelations. Mrs. Evelyn Sinclair received documentation about Celeste's fraudulent sponsorship practices and declining social media metrics. Richard Pemberton learned about the couple's mounting debt and their attempts to secure loans under false pretenses. Dr. Harrison Webb discovered the full scope of Adrian's financial improprieties and their implications for the hospital's reputation. Each conversation was brief, professional, and devastating. Vivienne wasn't ranting or emotional. She was simply providing information that allowed people to make informed decisions about their continued association with the couple. She was giving them the truth that Adrian and Celeste had worked so hard to conceal. By 9:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, a quiet buzz of conversation had spread through the gathering guests. Small groups huddled together, examining documents and sharing information with the kind of focused intensity that preceded major social upheavals. The bride and groom, still sequestered in their respective preparation areas, remained unaware that their carefully constructed narrative was unraveling in real time among the people they had expected to celebrate their triumph. Vivienne stood in the Manor's garden, watching through the windows as the social dynamics shifted and realigned with each new revelation. She had spent months planning this moment, and now she was watching her strategy unfold with the precision of a military operation. The intervention had begun, and there was no stopping what came next. The ceremony began at precisely 10 a.m., but the atmosphere in the Rosewood Manor gardens had transformed into something far more complex than anyone had anticipated. Guests took their seats with the kind of tense energy that accompanies moments when everyone knows something significant is about to happen, but no one is quite sure what form it will take. Whispered conversations continued even as the string quartet began playing, and phones were discreetly active as people shared information and documented what they suspected would become a legendary event in Millbrook Heights social history. Celeste descended the aisle in her grandmother's stolen wedding dress, her smile radiant but brittle, seemingly unaware that half the congregation was viewing her with newfound skepticism rather than admiration. Adrian waited at the altar with the kind of forced composure that suggested he was beginning to sense that something was wrong, but couldn't identify the source of his unease. Vivienne had positioned herself strategically in the fourth row, close enough to observe every detail but far enough back to avoid being immediately noticed by the wedding party. She held a small tablet containing her final presentation, a digital portfolio that would bring her months of planning to their ultimate conclusion. The ceremony proceeded through its traditional opening moments, with the officiant delivering remarks about love, commitment, and the importance of honesty in marriage. The irony was not lost on anyone who had been briefed on the morning's revelations. When the minister reached the portion of the service where he asked if anyone had objections to the union, the garden fell into a silence so complete that even the birds seemed to pause their singing. This was the moment Vivienne had been planning for, but she didn't speak immediately. Instead, she stood slowly and raised her hand with the calm authority of someone requesting recognition in a boardroom meeting. "Father Mackenzie," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the garden, "I believe the congregation deserves to hear some information before this ceremony continues." Celeste's face went white with shock, while Adrian's expression shifted from confusion to panic as he finally understood what was happening. The guests turned in their seats with the collective movement of an audience that had been expecting exactly this moment. "Vivienne," Celeste said, her voice rising with desperation, "this is not the time or place." "Actually," Vivienne interrupted, her tone remaining professionally calm, "this is exactly the time and place for truth. Since you've invited 200 people to celebrate what you've presented as a love story, I think they deserve to know what they're actually celebrating." She activated her tablet and began walking toward the front of the gathering, her presentation launching on the large screens that had been set up to display wedding photos and videos throughout the reception. Instead of romantic imagery, the screens now showed a timeline that documented the calculated nature of Adrian and Celeste's relationship. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vivienne began, her voice carrying the professional authority she had perfected through years of high-stakes presentations, "you're here today because you believe you're witnessing the marriage of two people who fell in love and couldn't deny their destiny. But what you're actually witnessing is the culmination of a carefully planned campaign to destroy my engagement and steal my fiancé for social media content." The screens displayed screenshots of deleted posts, cached web pages, and digital communications that showed the evolution of Adrian and Celeste's relationship, from business transaction to strategic partnership to public romance. Each piece of evidence was time-stamped and verified, creating an undeniable narrative that contradicted everything the guests had been told. "This relationship began," Vivienne continued, advancing through her presentation with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed every word, "when Celeste was hired as a social media consultant by the pharmaceutical company, sponsoring a medical conference in Chicago. Adrian paid her for services designed to boost his professional profile. Their romantic relationship was a secondary development that occurred after Celeste had already gathered detailed information about his personal life, including his engagement to me. The documentation was overwhelming in its thoroughness. Financial records showing payment for social media services, hotel receipts proving they had been in the same city before they claimed to have met, screenshots of private messages discussing their strategy for managing family drama and maximizing engagement potential. Dr. Harrison Webb rose from his seat in the front row, his expression grave as he addressed the couple directly. Adrian, is this information accurate? Have you been conducting a romantic relationship with a paid social media consultant while engaged to another woman? Adrian's attempt to respond was met with stammering denial that convinced no one. Dr. Webb, I can explain. It's not what it looks like. The timeline is confusing. But Vivienne wasn't finished. She advanced to the next section of her presentation, which detailed the financial fraud and professional misconduct that had been uncovered during her investigation. Dr. Blackthorne is currently under federal investigation for misappropriating research grant funds to finance his lifestyle and this wedding, she announced as the screens displayed bank records and expense reports. Miss Monroe has been terminated by multiple sponsors for fraudulent social media practices designed to inflate her influence and deceive advertisers. The evidence included termination letters from major brands, analytics reports showing artificial engagement patterns, and documentation of practices that violated both platform policies and advertising standards. Each revelation built upon the previous one, creating a comprehensive picture of two people who had built their public personas on systematic deception. Mrs. Evelyn Sinclair stood up from her seat and addressed Celeste directly. Young lady, are you telling us that you've been lying about your business practices while taking money from sponsors who trusted your integrity? Celeste's composure finally cracked completely. You don't understand, she said, her voice breaking with desperation. Everyone does it. The engagement numbers, the follower counts. It's just how the industry works, and Adrian and I really do love each other now, regardless of how it started. Love? Vivienne's voice cut through Celeste's explanation with surgical precision. Let me show everyone what your love really looks like. The final section of her presentation revealed the most damaging evidence. Private communications between Celeste and other influencers discussing their relationship as a career strategy, Adrian's mounting debt and financial desperation, and documentation showing how they had systematically deceived vendors, family members, and friends about their ability to pay for their elaborate lifestyle. The screens displayed messages where Celeste had referred to Adrian as her, quote, doctor-boyfriend content strategy, and discussed the family drama storyline as good for engagement metrics. Adrian's financial records showed credit card debt exceeding $150,000 and attempts to use research funding for personal expenses that had triggered the federal investigation. This wedding, Vivienne concluded, is being funded through credit fraud, vendor deception, and misappropriated grant money. The relationship you're being asked to celebrate was built on lies, maintained through manipulation, and designed to advance two people's careers at the expense of anyone who trusted them. The silence that followed was absolute. 200 guests sat in stunned silence as the full scope of the deception became clear. This wasn't a romantic love story that had overcome obstacles. It was a calculated business partnership that had destroyed lives and betrayed trusts with cold-blooded precision. Father Mackenzie, who had officiated hundreds of weddings throughout his career, found himself in a situation he had never encountered before. I'm afraid, he said quietly, that in good conscience I cannot proceed with a ceremony that appears to be built on such fundamental deception. One by one, guests began standing and walking away. Dr. Webb left immediately, followed by colleagues from the hospital who understood the professional implications of associating with Adrian's scandal. Mrs. Sinclair and her social circle departed with the kind of dramatic dignity that would ensure this story spread throughout Millbrook Heights society within hours. Even the wedding party began abandoning their posts, with bridesmaids and groomsmen quietly removing their boutonnieres and slipping away from what had become a public humiliation rather than a celebration. Adrian and Celeste stood alone at the altar, their carefully constructed world crumbling around them as the truth finally caught up with their lies. The wedding of the century had become the scandal of the decade, and there was no recovering from revelations that had been documented, verified, and witnessed by everyone who mattered in their social and professional circles. Vivienne packed up her tablet and walked away from Rosewood Manor, leaving behind the wreckage of a relationship that had never been real, and the public exposure of people who had forgotten that actions have consequences. Justice, it turned out, was even sweeter when it was served with professional precision and undeniable evidence. The aftermath of what became known as the Rosewood Revelation rippled through Millbrook Heights society with the force of a social earthquake, forever changing the landscape of the community's elite circles and establishing new standards for accountability among the influential families who had once thought themselves untouchable. Within hours of the wedding disaster, news of the dramatic confrontation had spread across social media platforms, local news outlets, and professional networks, creating a story that would be referenced for years as a cautionary tale about the dangers of building success on deception. For Adrian and Celeste, the consequences were swift and devastating. The federal investigation into grant misappropriation accelerated after the public exposure, with prosecutors viewing the wedding day revelations as evidence of Adrian's willingness to use deception in all aspects of his life. Within 3 weeks, he had been terminated from Mercy General Hospital, stripped of his medical licenses pending criminal proceedings, and faced with federal charges that would likely result in both substantial fines and prison time. Celeste's influencer career collapsed overnight as brands rushed to distance themselves from the scandal. Her social media accounts, once worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in sponsorship potential, became cautionary examples used in marketing courses about the importance of authentic partnerships. The @Celeste brand that had taken years to build was destroyed in a single day, with follower counts plummeting as the story of her deceptive practices spread throughout the digital marketing industry. Their relationship, predictably, did not survive the pressure of simultaneous personal and professional destruction. Within a month of their failed wedding, Adrian and Celeste were engaged in bitter legal battles over shared debts, with each blaming the other for their mutual downfall. The love story that had supposedly justified betraying family bonds revealed itself to be exactly what Vivienne had always known it was: a transactional arrangement that crumbled the moment it was no longer profitable for both parties. But the transformation that mattered most was Vivienne's own evolution from victim to victor, from someone whose life had been stolen to someone who had reclaimed not just her dignity but her power. The strategic brilliance she had demonstrated in orchestrating the wedding day revelation had not gone unnoticed by Millbrook Heights business community, where her reputation for thorough research, careful planning, and flawless execution had elevated her from disgraced ex-fiancé to sought-after crisis management consultant. Within 6 months of the Rosewood incident, Vivienne had launched Hartwell Strategic Communications, a boutique consulting firm specializing in reputation management and crisis resolution for high-profile individuals and organizations. Her client list quickly grew to include politicians facing scandals, corporations dealing with public relations disasters, and individuals who needed someone with the skills to navigate complex social and professional challenges. Her first major success came when she was hired by the Patterson Foundation to investigate irregularities in their grant distribution process, the same foundation whose funds Adrian had misappropriated. Her thorough investigation not only identified systemic weaknesses that had allowed the fraud to occur, but also developed new oversight procedures that became the industry standard for research funding organizations. The irony was not lost on anyone that Vivienne had turned her ex-fiancé's criminal behavior into a career opportunity that established her as the region's premier expert in financial fraud detection. The social dynamics of Millbrook Heights also shifted dramatically in response to the wedding revelation. The community's elite, who had once dismissed Vivienne's concerns and embraced her sister's narrative, found themselves reevaluating their own relationships and alliances. Mrs. Evelyn Sinclair, who had been so quick to support Celeste over Vivienne, now found her own social standing diminished, as people questioned her judgment and ability to distinguish between authentic and performative relationships. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, who had defended Adrian and dismissed Vivienne's warnings, faced professional consequences when her husband's research collaborations with Adrian were scrutinized during the investigation. Her credibility within the medical community suffered, and she was forced to acknowledge publicly that her personal loyalties had compromised her professional judgment. The Pemberton Country Club, where Vivienne had once been marginalized and excluded, extended a formal invitation for her to rejoin their board of directors. The charity organizations that had removed her from leadership positions during her crisis now competed to secure her expertise for their own events and fundraising efforts. The professional circles that had once closed ranks against her now sought her guidance and validation. But perhaps the most significant transformation was in Vivienne's relationship with her family. Her parents, who had chosen Celeste's side during the initial crisis and even given away Vivienne's inheritance to support the fraudulent relationship, were forced to confront the reality of their favoritism and poor judgment. Their attempts at reconciliation were met with professional courtesy but emotional distance, as Vivienne had learned too much about their character to ever fully trust them again. "I don't harbor anger toward you," she told her mother during one of their awkward coffee meetings 6 months after the wedding disaster. "But I also don't harbor illusions about who you are when difficult choices need to be made. You've shown me exactly where your loyalties lie, and I've adjusted my expectations accordingly." The grandmother's ring, which had been given to Celeste for Adrian's proposal, was quietly returned to Vivienne through a lawyer's office, accompanied by a note expressing regret, but no real accountability for the pain that had been caused by its initial transfer. Vivienne's story became legendary within professional and social circles, not just in Millbrook Heights but throughout the region, as an example of how strategic thinking and careful planning could overcome even the most devastating personal betrayals. Business schools used her case study to teach courses on crisis management and reputation rehabilitation. Law enforcement agencies consulted her methods for investigating white-collar crime. Social media platforms referenced her documentation techniques when developing policies to combat influencer fraud. Her success attracted national attention when she was featured in Forbes magazine as one of 30 under 30 crisis management experts, with the article specifically citing her innovative approach to using digital forensics and social media analysis to expose fraudulent business practices. The same woman who had been dismissed as a bitter ex-fiancé was now being recognized as a pioneer in her field. More importantly, Vivienne had discovered something about herself that she had never fully understood before the crisis. She was not just professionally competent, but personally resilient in ways that surprised even her. The systematic destruction of her life had revealed reserves of strength, strategic thinking, and emotional intelligence that she had never been forced to access before. She had learned that true power didn't come from trying to prevent betrayal or control other people's choices, but from having the skills and resources to respond effectively when betrayal inevitably occurred. She had discovered that justice was not something that happened to you, but something you created through careful planning and strategic action. The woman who had once defined herself through her relationship with Adrian and her position in Millbrook Heights society had evolved into someone who defined herself through her own capabilities and achievements. She had learned to build a life that was anti-fragile, not just resistant to attack, but actually strengthened by attempts to destroy it. 5 years after the Rosewood revelation, Vivienne Hartwell had become exactly what she had always been but had never fully recognized: a force to be reckoned with. A woman who understood that the best revenge wasn't just living well, but using the skills gained from surviving betrayal to help others navigate their own crises and emerge stronger than before. Because sometimes the greatest transformation comes not from avoiding life's worst moments, but from discovering exactly who you become when you refuse to let those moments define you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.